As Catholics, we're oftentimes accused of too much focus on suffering. We have crucifixes that populate our churches and oftentimes are front and center in large form. We have the Stations of the Cross. We have mantras where parents tell their kids, offer it up, right? And we speak of purgatory, just in case you didn't get enough suffering here on earth, right? So, but we must not be ashamed of speaking of suffering. We must balance it appropriately with the life, the love, and the hope of Christ that calls us to enter into life in the fullest, as he said in John 10:10, that he came to give us life to the fullest. But at the same time, and especially today, we know that life is full of suffering. And if we don't have a theology that incorporates and embraces suffering, we are in for a long and frustrating life of contradiction and confusion. Today is Good Friday, and today we look upon the most innocent, perfect, and sinless human being that ever lived, and a God that loved us enough to create us out of nothing and give us everything. Now whipped, beaten, mocked, crowned with thorns, nailed to a cross, and killed for something he didn't do. We read in Hebrews 2, verse 10, for it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through suffering. Why? Because Adam and Eve at a tree disobeyed God and opened up Pandora's box of selfishness and rebellion. Christ, the new Adam, at a tree, had to demonstrate against all odds that the way back was through obedience, radical obedience, even unto death. Philippians 2:8 says, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. He had to show us that the way to fulfillment and perfection in a fallen world was not found in running from the cross, running from suffering, or even running from God. That only leaves us face to face with suffering, alone, with little to assuage or assist. Adam and Eve tried to avoid suffering by eating from the tree. What was the suffering they were trying to avoid? Well, the first was the threat from the serpent, right? We hear actually in Jewish commentaries that the word wasn't serpent, the word was dragon. So Adam, who's given the responsibility of guarding the garden, is facing the one significant lethal threat he would ever meet, standing right there before him. And he was terrified. He was feeling his mortality, his humanity. The other threat was, the other suffering they were trying to avoid was by gaining the opportunity to redefine right and wrong. A lot of our suffering comes from that simple definition of what's right and what's wrong. And Satan was offering them the equality with God. You will be like God, to redefine what was right and wrong, and therefore alleviate themselves out of suffering. But in doing so, as I said, they simply unleashed the full onslaught of suffering that we have inherited to this very day. Suffering is unavoidable in life. All you got to do is look at the people that Jesus raised from the dead. He raised the widow of Nain's son. He raised the daughter of Jairus. And we just read a couple days ago that he raised Lazarus. But they all got sick and died again. Suffering is inevitable and unavoidable. To try to avoid it is only to put off the inevitable, or to try to ignore it and stuff it down until it causes psychosis. Or, perhaps even more insidious, to push it off onto somebody else. Christ instead shows us another way, the right way, the fully human and divine way, to embrace and enter into suffering with the full knowledge and trust and love of God and neighbor. To know the God we follow, who modeled it for us, and to trust the love that he has for us and the love that he's called us to. And to know the neighbor that we endure the suffering from, or for, or with, and to generously do it anyway. For that passage in Hebrews continues. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified have all one origin. We share in flesh and blood, and we will share in future glory. This is a common theme of St. Paul. If we share in his suffering, we will share in his glory. If we share in his death, we will share in his resurrection. But first, we must share in his suffering, even unto death. Because suffering is the consequence and punishment of our original sin. Even after the sin has been forgiven and removed, it remains. Because in that, when we get too comfortable, when we get too busy, when we start to believe that we are doing fine in the business of life, God allows suffering to remind us that we need him, that we cannot do it without him, and that our complacency will lead to the neglect of those who are suffering, which will lead to division and sin, which will lead to the loss of God's fullness of life, love, and purpose in our lives. And we will end up shallow and alone. And this God does not want. He did not plan and will not allow, insofar as he will allow and do what is necessary to correct and to reignite our souls with his love. Because otherwise, we become like Adam and Eve all over again. You know, it's a bit ironic. Adam and Eve were tempted by Satan to try to avoid suffering by becoming like God. When indeed, in reality, as we see all too clearly today, our God enters into suffering to redeem, heal, restore, and resurrect us. Our God suffers. We have a choice then. But let that choice not be driven by guilt, but by grace. Guilt enters into suffering with a reluctant surrender. Well, Jesus did this for me, so yeah, guess I got to do it for him. Grace enters into suffering with an embrace of loving generosity, as Christ did. A response that affects salvation and rebirth, power and gift that God wants to give on earth today through our joyful and loving obedience in our suffering, even unto death. As we come to the cross tonight to reverence in awe, let us ask him for that gift, to replace guilt with grace, surrender with embrace, reluctance with love.